Imagine a scenario where a force like Hamas or a force like the IRGC is deliberately arming a 14-year-old in civilian clothing with an AK-47. They put him in front of a window and they say, shoot down anybody that walks down this street. Well, now I see flashes coming. Bullets are coming at me. They're hitting my guys. So we return fire into that window. We have violated no rules of land warfare. We have violated nothing within the spirit of the Geneva Convention. You know who has? The Hamas fighters that put an AK-47 in that boy's hands. But as soon as that boy gets killed as a result of us returning fire, right now, all of a sudden, we killed a child. But the aftermath will be well-trained American operative kills 14-year-old boy. And that's what the BBC will run with. That's what CNN will run with. That's what the American people will hear. And now what you've done, and this is the most horrific part, what you've now done is you've created an incentive structure. We've told Hamas is, you know what you should do? Next time you should put the AK-47 in the hands of a 14-year-old girl, because that's going to brief even worse than the American press.
In a recent conversation with Winston Marshall, former U.S. Army Special Forces soldier and commentator Nick Freitas explained what he believes is one of the most misunderstood realities of modern warfare. Drawing on his own military experience, Freitas argues that terrorist organizations like Hamas intentionally exploit Western values, media coverage, and public opinion as part of their battlefield strategy. Whether you agree with this conclusion or not, the scenario he describes raises a difficult question about civilian casualties, responsibility, and the nature of asymmetric warfare. Here's Nick Freitas on the Winston Marshall Show.
Whenever you're talking about like an Islamic terror group like Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis, or you're talking about the IRGC, which also falls into that category, they have a very, very different calculus for how they conduct warfare. And one of the things that they understand implicitly about the West is we have a very low threshold for civilian casualties. And so if you can maximize civilian casualties, you can get the populations of the countries which are currently launching strikes against you to pull back and to stop.
Even your own civilian casualties. That's the.
You want your own civilian casualties. Like and here's the part that needs to be properly understood, because I obviously think as most Westerners do, that civilian casualties are abhorrent. We don't want that. And if you look at the degree, and again, people will compare it with the utopian vision of warfare. You can't. You have to compare it with the history of warfare as we know and understand it. Preventing civilian casualties, it is a rather new phenomenon in warfare, right? This is not something that is, a lot of this originates from Augustine just war theory, or Augustinian just war theory. And so it's this idea that we restrain ourselves. And you look at this within codes of chivalry as well, as how do we conduct warfare in such a way to where it's not so brutal or so devastating that it is horribly immoral in every sense. By the same token, you have to destroy your enemy's warfighting capabilities. So we have to balance these things. How do I attempt to minimize civilian casualties with the understanding that civilian casualties are going to be a natural consequence of what happens when trying to defeat another country's ability to conduct war? Now, in the West, what we've done is we've set up various rules. So we look at these of the Geneva Convention. We look at rules of land warfare. We have these various standards that we apply. Here is the very frustrating part for a soldier. I follow these rules. I train to follow these rules. I wear a uniform. When I go and I conduct urban warfare operations in Iraq, I go through an incredible amount of training and put myself in an incredible amount of danger in order to prevent civilian casualties. I don't just get to go kicking in door to door to door, shooting whoever happens to be in there. I have to isolate the threat from all the non-combatant targets. And by the way, those non-combatant targets are not all non-combatants in the sense that they don't resist or fight,
right?
But they're not a uniformed enemy. So they may be entirely helpful to their husband or their brother or their son, which is trying to kill me. And by the way, he's not wearing a uniform. And he's willing to hide behind them in order to fight me. So now we already have an asymmetric disadvantage with respect to what they're able to get away with and what I'm able to get away with, both for moral reasons as well as practical reasons. There's also practical reasons why you want to minimize civilian casualties.
Like,
for instance, if you're killing a ton of civilians, you're actually providing the other side with not just fodder in Western media. All of us care about our families. If you kill somebody that's close to me, you create another enemy, right? So there's practical reasons why we don't want to do this along with moral ones. But now imagine a scenario where a force like Hamas or a force like the IRGC is deliberately arming a 14-year-old in civilian clothing with an AK-47. They put him in front of a window and they say, shoot down anybody that walks down this street. Now, to give you a little bit of understanding of my background and training, I was infantry trained, airborne trained, air assault trained, ranger trained, sniper trained, special forces qualification course, special forces urban assault course, Sephardic, which is one of our primary CQB schools, close air support training. Like if you compare that with the rest of the world, that puts me in a very, very narrow category of soldiers with a great deal of training experience and funding that went in to get me to that sort of capability and capacity. And guess what? I'm not bulletproof. A 14-year-old spraying 7.62 by 3.9, out of an AK-47 down a narrow alleyway that I happen to be walking through because I don't bomb the whole city block. I try to clear building by building by building to mitigate civilian casualties. Well, now I see flashes coming. Bullets are coming at me. They're hitting my guys. So we return fire into that window. We have violated no rules of land warfare. Mm-hmm. We have violated nothing within the spirit of the Geneva Convention. You know who has? The Hamas fighters that put an AK-47 in that boy's hands. But as soon as that boy gets killed as a result of us returning fire, right now, all of a sudden, we killed a child. Not we killed a military-age male. Not we killed somebody that Hamas put in a horrible situation, maybe through coercion or maybe through indoctrination. At the point of that engagement, it doesn't matter. I am legally allowed to return fire in that situation. But the aftermath will be well-trained American operative kills 14-year-old boy. And that's what the BBC will run with. That's what CNN will run with. That's what the American people will hear. They will wonder why it required that level of force and violence and aggression in order to achieve our objectives. Aren't we so much more powerful than they are? Mm-hmm. Yes, but not in that scenario. Why? Because that's also a form of asymmetry. If I put that person in the right place where he knows where I'm coming through, he has a great deal of strategic advantage there, even if he doesn't have the advantage of training and expertise and weaponry. Yeah. It's enough. It's enough to balance it out. And now what you've done, and this is the most horrific part, when the Western media reports it the way they do, and when the American voting public or the British voting public or whoever hears it the way they do, and when they talk about it the way they do, and when they insist that now we have to pull back or the Israelis have to pull back or whoever else has to pull back, what you've now done is you've created an incentive structure. We've told Hamas is, you know what you should do? Next time you should put the AK-47 in the hands of a 14-year-old girl, because that's going to brief even worse in the American press. Yeah. What we should be doing, if we were really serious about enforcing rules about the Geneva Convention or rules of land warfare or whatever it is, if we were serious, anytime we caught an organization doing things like that and we captured, not the 14-year-old, but the 45-year-old that's doing that, we would execute them immediately. Why? Because they're not a soldier. They're not a terrorist. There's only a benefit to following the rules of land warfare or the Geneva Convention if you're protected for following it. Yeah. They're rewarded for not following it. And so it's amazing how the very malleable and influenced sensibilities of the West create the very incentive structures that terrorist organizations now use in asymmetric fashion in order to put their own civilian population in greater danger.
It begs the question, seeing as this has all been weaponized against Western nations, why do we still go along with it?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think there's an element within the West, within our politics and what, that is openly subversive to the West. Hey, I think there are plenty of people that were born in the West, raised in the West, that believe that the West is inherently evil. I served on I did 11 years active duty in the military, but then I did 10 years in the state legislature in Virginia. I sat on the education committee. It was fascinating to me to watch how within our public school system, but especially within higher education, there is a narrative about the West that teaches students to believe that we are evil, that we are responsible for most of the world's pain and suffering. To the extent that we are successful economically or socially, that's purely because we exploited the rest of the world. Now, a very summary view of history will teach you how absurd that is. Not that there aren't instances of the West obviously engaging in acts, whether it be slavery or other things like that, that are abhorrent. But to suggest that everything that we have in the West is purely a result of Western exploitation of the third world or other countries, that's a Marxist fairy tale.
Yeah, but Nick, that answer suggests that you don't think we should go along with those traditional rules of war, and that we shouldn't go along with the whatever it is that Geneva Convention is telling us and binding us by.
It's not an either-or proposition. What we should do is actually apply our own standards. So, for instance, if I'm fighting in Iraq and you present as a soldier, I will treat you like one. And as you present as a terrorist, I will treat you like one. Because that's what we're trying to do. If we're trying to disincentivize terrorist activity, if we're trying to disincentivize civilian casualties, well, then you have to appropriately punish the people that are actually deliberately targeting civilians. You can't treat them as soldiers like you would somebody else in a uniform. So no, we can certainly apply a moral standard by the way we conduct warfare. But when we find or capture the people that do not play by those same rules, they should be treated brutally. They should be treated brutally.
I'm trying to put myself in the mind of that combatant going in what you just described there and being in the combat zone. The caliber of individual, if they are to be able to firstly know they're risking their life and have the military training that they do, and be able to deal with the sort of the 3 or 4 or 5 games that are happening at once. One is the actual combat to combat interface. Then there's the what does this mean if this happens? And this, if I kill this person in this kind of way, what are the consequences for my battalion or whoever I'm with in the now? And then what are the consequences at the legal level and then at the press level and the media level? How on earth can anyone operate under those circumstances?
I don't think most of them do. I think your average infantry soldier is primarily concerned with, they will look at the training they receive, they will understand the rules of engagement that they're supposed to operate under, and then they will do the best job they can in order to accomplish their mission within those rules and guidelines and mission objectives. So they're not sitting there thinking about what everything is going to potentially show up on CNN. Now, I will say that the more everything you did showed up on social media or CNN, the more people became aware of it. And it can be debilitating. You can be sitting there wondering, am I going to, you're already having to wonder, will I die walking down this alley trying to find the subject or the terrorist that I'm looking for? But yet, increasingly, you do have to take into consideration, and even if I do everything right, how will it present on the media if for some reason somebody catches this and puts it on TikTok? So I think that's becoming more of a reality with this generation of soldiers. My son is now an infantryman in the United States Army, and the stuff that they have to look at with respect to drones, but the stuff that they also have to consider with respect to, again, rules of warfare, rules of engagement, and then how things can be perceived in the public it has to be taken into consideration when you're actually in a very dangerous situation. The first thing that you're worried about is, how do I successfully accomplish my mission and make sure the person to my left or right comes out alive?
You mentioned Augustine, right?
Yep.
Now, just warfare. This is what, the 5th century he's writing.
Earlier.
It's earlier, right? It's maybe 4th century. Since then, there are plenty of wars where the Western nations, I mean, I think of the Crusades, both sides, they didn't really care about how many people were killed on the other side. It was just about victory. And so I try to understand what it is that's despite, so my point here, is that Augustine was writing centuries before the Crusades, but it didn't have the necessary, they were obviously going along with their interpretation of just war theory. And I believe that most of the Crusades were just, but that's a side point. But it's clearly the case that the Crusaders didn't have the same concept of caring about the opponents and their lives in the same way that we do in the Western modern infantryman and the serviceman thinks. So I want to understand that ideology and how we got to where we are now, and this kind of international law and why we're so we kind of treat it as sacred, really.
I think part of it is when Europeans are fighting Europeans, you'll still see a great deal of brutality, but because there is some degree of shared culture, again, you will see even when we think about some of the horrific stuff, horrific things that various regimes have done in Europe. Germany being, paramount. There were still certain rules on how we'll say British soldiers and German soldiers engage with one another. So you would still find elements of that kind of shared chivalry there that you wouldn't find if you went to a concentration camp. And so there was still this effort, even if it was logically inconsistent. There was still this effort to say, okay, there's kind of a code.
Well, what is that code, though? What is that?
I think some of it is, so let's bring it down to kind of an instinctual level. So when two men get in a fight with one another, there's actually a degree of respect that goes into this idea of you fought, I fought, maybe one of us won, maybe neither of us really won, but we still respect that I'm talking to another man that was willing to engage in martial combat with me. And I think that some of that is kind of written into the code. I think some of that is kind of God's design, right? Especially when there is...
You mean it's natural?
Yes. Especially when there's some sort of shared history or tradition. Because you look at most of Europe, there's a lot of shared traditions, even though you have very, very different cultures in certain respects. But if an Englishman in Berlin or German in London is not going to be horribly confused by what they see around them, right? Now, again, the more you separate that, the more the cultures are very, very different or even diametrically opposed. It seems like that there's more leeway for what you might consider to be atrocity because there's less understanding of the culture or what it represents, and it becomes easier to also suggest that this is uniquely evil or horrible or whatever else it might be. But I still think that there's some element that when two men fight one another, the more shared traditions or experiences they have, the more likely you're to see some sort of respect post-fight.
That doesn't help me with my question, though, because that would apply surely to all men from all cultures and all races.
That's the difference, right? Is that it's orders of magnitude, right? So if I'm fighting another American, that's still an American. Right, so there's a great deal of shared attrition. We may let's say we're in a pub, we're in a bar, we get in a fight, but we both conduct ourselves with a certain degree of honor and whatnot. There might be a kind of mutual respect that is actually built at the end of that fight, maybe, right? The less shared cultural relevance there is between us, the less likely I would argue
that would mean that Western fighters would have a disregard for non-Western fighters. But the problem we've got is that Western armies and armed forces hold human life at a different level and hold their own behavior in war to a different level than non-Western nations.
Yeah, well, because we're taught to.
Because we're taught to.
Yes, if you go into other, again, okay, we'll talk about the Islamic world, for instance. There's still a respect for power. So every operation I went on in Iraq, with a couple of exceptions, I went with the Iraqi army or with Iraqi police or with Iraqi militia, and they all respected the fact that the United States was overwhelmingly powerful in that environment. So there was a respect there for power, because power was universally respected on some level. It may even be despised, but it's respected. But I also have no question that had the roles been reversed and we were not the dominant force, that respect would be eroded instantly. Because again, largely within that realm, I'm an infidel. And so I'm already, a lower form, a lesser form on some level.
Yeah.
So if you're engaging in combat, or if you're engaging in conflict with a culture that has taught their young men to believe something very, very different than what you've taught your young men to believe, then you're going to get different results at the end of that conflict. Now, what I would argue, though, and one of the people that did a very good job of arguing about this on a cultural level was Victor Davis Hanson. If you've ever read Carnage and Culture, he talks about one of the battles that he uses as an example of kind of East versus West was the Carthaginians, which is not even purely Eastern in nature, but it's definitely different. And the Romans. The Carthaginians devastated the Romans at Cannae, absolutely wiped out their military elite. And yet within 2 years, Rome was able to field an army and go back and eventually destroy Carthage in a way that the Carthaginians could never manage to do with the Romans. And so he also brings up Thermopylae in Greece. Like, why was it even possible for the Macedonians under Alexander to be able to take on and conquer the Persian Empire, which had far more resources, So I think that I don't think that the argument should be that the West needs to change its cultural disposition with respect to just warfare. I think we need to more logically apply it, which is to say that we shouldn't grant concessions to combatants which are not following the same rules. I can still think of, I don't seek to harm their women and children. I don't seek to harm their non-combatants. But if you choose to conduct yourself as a combatant, you've chosen to fight, well, then I'm going to treat you in accordance with the rules that you play by. And if you play by a rule that completely disrespects any sort of concept of just war, any sort of concept of rules of land warfare, well, then you don't get the protections that the rules of land warfare are supposed to provide you. And that's the big missing part right now. It's this absurd notion in a enlightened, classically liberal West where, well, gosh, if we do that, we're no better than them. Well, okay, wait a second. Yeah. There's categories of that. You're right. If they conduct terrorism, I don't respond with terrorism because terrorism is innately evil in and of itself. But if you're a terrorist, I also don't treat you like a uniformed soldier obeying the rules of land warfare.
Right.
I should make it terrifying for you to engage as a terrorist. We don't do that. We treat a terrorist like we would one of our own uniformed soldiers half the time. And that's absurd.
That was Nick Freitas speaking with Winston Marshall. His argument is that when terrorist groups deliberately place civilians in harm's way, the resulting tragedy doesn't just create casualties, it can create incentives for those tactics to be used again. Do you agree with Nick's assessment, or do you think he's missing something? Let us know in the comments below. And please subscribe and consider becoming a member to our channel. Thank you.